Hello, Michael.
Yeah, hi, Chris.
I know. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I know you're a busy man and you've got lots of engagement, so I really appreciate it. In regards to this interview, I want to talk to you about the books that you've written,
Yeah.
specifically two actually. One of which I've heard of and I've heard other people talk about, and one of which I've read.
Mhm.
But before we get onto those two books, I do with all the guests. Can you just tell me your journey up until this point, like your journey as a writer?
Yeah, sure. I've been a writer and a journalist for most of my life. The part of my career that led to what we're going to talk about involved living here in Berlin, where I happen to be again, when I was working for Spiegel Online as an editor. And I followed a trial of 10 Somali pirates in Hamburg for Spiegel. And after about a year of that, I decided to go to Somalia to get more background on that story and think about a book. Before that, I had written a novel and also a travel book about the history of surfing, which brought me around the world to about 8 different countries. And I wrote not just about surfing, but in depth about those countries. So that was the kind of stuff, the kind of journalism that I had been doing up to that point. It always involved engaging with a different culture, and it tended to involve the ocean.
Yeah, indeed. And my first time I'd heard of you as a writer was actually on Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
where he discussed the first book that we're going to talk about.
Mhm.
And for those who don't know, it's the Desert and the Sea, where you were basically kept captive for 777 days in Somalia. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
977 days,
Oh,
and it's
900 days.
and that book's my third book actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that resonated with me, and I got the book from that, and I was totally engaged with it. And it resonated with me in particular because coming from the UK when I was younger, we had similar stories that were making the news every night with John McCarthy and Terry Waite as well.
Yeah.
But that was in Lebanon.
Yeah.
But like with every story, we'll start at the beginning. So you talked about Somali, like being in Berlin and writing about Somali pirating. What
Mhm.
made you decide to go from Berlin to actually be at the heart of the story?
Well, the trial in Hamburg was actually a very big deal, at least at the time in Europe, because it was the first time there had been pirates in front of a German judge in 400 years, which means that the sort of resurgence of piracy off the Somali coast was really something unusual. There had been no really high profile and organized piracy around the world in about 2 centuries. And it had been 4 centuries since anyone had been prosecuted in Germany. So, and the story itself of the 10 pirates who tried to take a German cargo ship and then got arrested basically by the Dutch Navy it wasn't as high stakes or movie ready, but it was on a par with Captain Phillips, and it was a story that Americans didn't know. So I thought here's a really good topic for a book about piracy, which had really intrigued me for more than just that year, um, for a couple of years. And so I thought I'd get more background on what I'd been seeing in the courtroom by going to Somalia. And the place that we wound up focusing on was a town called Galkayo, where about 5 of the 10 pirates were from. And we happened to know a Somali elder here in Berlin who was from there and who was friends with the local clan, the regional clan. And he said we would be guests of the clan if we went there. I went there with one other journalist, and we worked on separate stories. And that Somali elder had also brought at least one other TV journalist down there to go through central Somalia and talk about pirates. So he had a track record, and the region was the right area. It was the right idea for the book that I wanted to write.
Okay, so when you got into Somalia, were they had already been journalists or envoys that had been kidnapped and captured before you got there?
I don't know if other journalists had been captured. Other journalists had certainly gone to Galkayo and gone out to the coast along the same route that we had planned. So we weren't doing anything that was terribly new. Uh, but there had been other hostages taken by the same the same pirate gang. Um, let's see, other journalists. I mean, there must have been. There were up in Somaliland, which is a different region. There was a British journalist taken, and there must have been. I'm pretty sure there was a retired journalist taken from northern Kenya, and she was held kind of further south. And yes, there were a few other freelancers that were taken hostage around Somalia, but in that particular region, I think there were two NGO members who were hostage at that time. And otherwise, in all of Somalia, something like 700 or 800 seafarers.
Okay, cool. So I imagine you've done this plenty of times already, but can you remember, go into detail, like the day in which you were captured? First of all, were you aware there was going to be any danger or leading up to it? And also, can you describe the day when you were captured?
Oh, we were well aware. My partner Ashwin Rahman and I made sure that we had a security team all lined up before we got there. In fact, they met us at the airport when we landed. So we were very consciously guests of the local clan, but also provided with for security for the whole time. And we had paid our contact here in Berlin pretty well for that. So, and we had both gotten support, the backing of, I had a grant from the Pulitzer Center in Washington, DC, and Ashwin had a whole package from a German channel here to do a documentary. So we were pretty well prepared. And we had about 10 days of pretty good reporting. I mean, we stayed not just in Galkayo, but we went out, which, in sort of a caravan, into the bush and out to the coast to report actually from a pirate town called, um, oh Jesus, called Hobyo. Hobyo is actually a known, and for people who followed piracy at the time, Hobyo was a known town. Galkayo was a larger town, but lesser known because it wasn't on the coast. So that sort of pendulum swing between the towns was something other journalists had done too. But we had a pirate to talk to
Mhm.
in Hobyo. I mean, a pirate boss. And we thought that was the dangerous part of this trip. That was where we went out with a full contingent of about 30 guards and 3 or 4 vehicles. So when we got back from Hobyo, we thought we were in good shape. Nobody got kidnapped out there. But then my partner Ashwin decided to fly to Mogadishu instead of going home directly with me to Nairobi. And I had a few more, that was our original plan, was to go in and out at the same time. And then I had a few more days of reporting to do and a couple of other projects, or a couple of other just things I wanted to get done. And when Ashwin decided to get on his plane, we decided to go all together. And that morning, our guards didn't show up. So that was a big red flag. But our Berlin contact, the Somali elder that we knew from Berlin, Mohammed, he contacted the president. The president was a cousin of his. The president sent his own car with one bodyguard, but still we thought, the president's car should be okay. And we went out to the airport and there was a delay, of course. Ashwin finally got on his plane, and then on the way back from the airport, once Ashwin was airborne, actually, the rest of us in the president's car got waylaid by a battle wagon, something called a technical, but anyway, a fairly fearsome truck midway between the airport and the town. I mean, we were just going back to my hotel. And a technical in Somalia is a flatbed truck with a cannon mounted in the back. They're pretty common from the Somali Civil War. Not unusual to see. It seemed to frighten Mohammed, our guide. And the driver paused and the technical pulled up and aimed the cannon right through the windshield. Didn't fire it, but scared off our guard, so he didn't even fire a shot. And about 10 or 12 guys came off the flatbed, came to my side of the car, opened up the door, and pulled me out.
Gosh, I mean, I can't, as you say now, I'm trying to imagine it in my mind, and to brutally
Yeah.
honest, you can't, because Normally, with journalism, especially in war-torn countries, do you get some sort of, I know there's a difference between training and reality, but do you get some sort of course saying, actually, these are the scenarios that actually could happen and you need to be careful and this is what you need to do? I know that
Yeah.
sounds a bit away with the fares a little bit, but do you get that sort of crash course in what to do in that situation?
Well, there is a journalism. You mean a formal course?
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't, but there is a journalism guild here, a journalism union called Verdi that does those maybe twice a year. And the time I was a member and I could consider doing it, but the timing was just off before we had to go. So I wound up not doing it. I turned out to be I could give one now, I turned out to do almost everything right. But what those courses don't teach you are, among other things, is how to do a hunger strike. They don't go that far. So there are definitely things that I had to learn, and they were the most difficult things that the courses didn't even teach. But what they do mostly is tell you not to resist in most cases, and I'm not sure what they say about escape, but I did try to escape once.
Yeah, yeah. So when they pulled you out your car, the motorcade, where what did they do next? Because I remember reading the book. Didn't you try to fight off or to break your wrist and your wrist was
Yeah, that's right. They opened the rear door, and I mean I saw them coming with the guns. They had fired into the air. I thought at that moment I was dead, but when I wasn't, I made sure that I held the door shut. And since it was my arm that was doing it, they beat on my arm with with their Kalashnikovs. They broke my wrist, not in half, but they broke my wrist, and then they pulled me out. Then they beat on my scalp and bloodied my scalp. My glasses, which I was wearing, were broken in the dust, and I never saw them again. So I spent the next 2.5 years blind, basically. And then they bundled me into an SUV that was waiting off to the side of the road, and that was the getaway car. So they drove away with me uh, about 3 hours into the Somali bush.
okay. And then from there, basically what happened after that? Because when did they actually put you into your what was basically your home for the next nearly 3 years?
Yeah, well, not that specific location, but yes, this underworld that hostages live in Somalia. Like I said, we had gone out to Hobyo in sort of a caravan of SUVs, and when we were in the middle of the bush, we stopped, I think, overnight in a village that belonged to one of the elders, one of the clan elders, uh, sort of the top guy in the Sa'ad clan in that region. And it was his hometown, and we stayed with his sister, his sister's family, and that kind of thing. While we were there, we heard these rumors that hostages were around, right? We heard that somehow Filipino hostages were somewhere in the area, and so you heard these things in Somalia, but you never saw a hostage. You just heard rumors. And suddenly I was in that place where the hostages were, out of sight, but still pretty openly, a plane could have seen us out in the middle of nowhere in Somalia. So we wound up in this camp in the middle of the bush. I mean, the SUV took us to a place where there were other hostages. They took us to there were about 5 Somalis with their Kalashnikovs in this sort of bouncing SUV, and we wound up at a camp. And even without my glasses, I could kind of tell that there were other hostages there. There were certainly other pirates, just young men with guns. And there was a mattress waiting for me. So it was planned. And then I sat down, and the first thing I wondered is exactly where I was in Somalia, because that would have determined who had captured me. I had no idea who it was, whether it was pirates from the same clan that was supposed to be protecting me, in which case there was a betrayal, or if it was pirates from a different clan, in which case there might be a clan war over me, which might mean a lot of violence. And if it had been from a different clan, then they would have brought me across the border into Puntland, which is the next state, the next region. And I obviously had no idea, but I could tell that we had driven towards the ocean. which meant we were more or less, unless we had changed regions, we were more or less in the same area as I was that night where I first heard the rumors of, Filipino hostages or something. So I was literally in that underworld. But we only stayed in that camp for about 2 nights. No, one night. And then we went probably into Hobyo, certainly into some sort of a town, and stayed in a prison house for about 4 days. And we left that place, and it was a filthy house, but and not pleasant, but at least we had shelter. But we left that immediately when there was a rescue by American forces of the 2 NGO workers I just mentioned. So those 2 who had been held hostage for about 3 months were rescued in a successful operation by SEALs. And I didn't know the details, but I heard from the pirates that there had been helicopters and American Marines or something. And that was why they were scared, and that was why they had taken us out of the house and were driving us around in the bush. And we stayed, they seemed to be driving at random for most of that day, and then we finally settled in kind of a wooded area in a valley, which is one of the only places in that whole region of Somalia that seemed to have trees. And so we stayed under a tree for the next 3 weeks.
Gosh, incredible. Tell me, one thing that you say throughout the book is you talk about cat, which is this plant. Can you just describe that in more detail and how it affected the soldiers from a mental point of view?
Yeah, the khat was simply a leaf, or actually a stem, a leafy plant that they chewed, and it got them high. One of the Somalis, so Somalia is a Muslim country, um, and one of the pirates said, "This is the Somali beer," instead of drinking alcohol. This is just a typical thing they did every day to get a little bit buzzed. And it's very common in Yemen too. And it's a very social thing. It's mostly men who do it. Women might sell it, but it's mostly men who chew it. And at a given point in the afternoon, um, pirate or not, Somali men will sit down and brew some very sweet tea and sit there and chew khat for a little while. The pirates I met were extremely addicted, and they waited. The most important moment of the day was, and it happened every day, was the delivery of khat for the guards. And they would then, after it came normally in the afternoon, they would sit down in front of a big pile of it and sit there and chew. And one thing that one of the pirates told me while he was chewing khat was, "Michael, you should try some because it makes your problems disappear." And it doesn't, in short.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Did any of them, was there occasion you said he was delivered? Was there occasion when he wasn't delivered and they had to suffer from withdrawal symptoms? And I asked that because if that was the case, I
Mhm.
imagine they could be getting very nasty very quickly, the guards, if he didn't have it.
Yeah, no, I don't think it ever wasn't delivered. I think, well, maybe once or twice. If anything, there were days when it was late. And I think the cycle was they would be depressed and sluggish until the khat arrived, and then they would start to feel more like themselves. And if they had too much, then they would get really, or it was strong khat, which could also be the case. Then they got really agitated, and the times that I saw fist fights between the pirate guards was normally after the khat arrived, towards the evening when they had all eaten a lot, and it was all pretty good stuff, and then they started to argue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Indeed, indeed. So, did you see any hostages there? Were there any hostages near you? And if so, did you strike up relationships with them?
Yeah, starting from the second day. So in that camp, there were in fact 2 hostages. There was 2 private fishermen from the Seychelles, um, Rolly and Mark. And Rolly Tambara became my friend for the next 9 months. Like I said, I wasn't very aware when I first sat down on the mattress, and I, had no glasses to see or distinguish people. But the next morning, the pirates pulled up a truck so that they could take us into the prison house. And they put me in the back seat, and there were 2 other guys, and they were all, we all got bound together with rope. So I was quite aware that they were hostages. And the first thing I did was ask Rolly where he was from, and he went, and for the next I don't know, week or so, 4 days we were kept in separate houses in the prison house, but after the 4 days we went out because of that SEAL operation somewhere else in Somalia. And even while Rolly and I had been thrown together and were sitting next to each other in a random bush camp, I tried to talk to Rolly and he would go. He didn't want to bother the pirates. He didn't know what was going on, and he just felt it would be more prudent not to talk. But after a while, of course, we talked, and Rolly turned out to be a chatterbox. But he and Mark had been captured on the water about 700 miles from Somalia while they were cleaning fish on Rolly's boat. And the pirates boarded with weapons and ordered Rolly to steer for Hobyo. And they landed at Hobyo a full week after that. So that's how far they were. They were much closer to the Seychelles than they were to Somalia. And they had been held on land, more or less in the same place for almost 3 months. And then when I got there, then they started to move around. So the pirates were very nervous about holding an American.
Gosh. How much were you aware of any ransom negotiations they were making with you? Did you overhear any guards talk about those?
Yeah, the first week was very tense because I knew that the first thing that had to happen in a situation like that was a ransom demand, right? And for a week, I didn't even see a telephone. But after a week, Rolly and I were in this camp in the woods under a tree. And one morning, a guard sort of said, "Get up." And Rolly had to get up, and they took him up to a bluff. And he came back and he said, "Oh, I made a phone call to my family." And he said the demand for the two of us, for Rolly and Mark, was $10 million or $20 million, 10 million each. And he said, "My family has no idea how they're going to get that kind of money and everything." And then the same guard said to me, "Get up." And we went up to the bluff and they handed me a phone. There were two pirate bosses at the top sitting cross-legged in the dirt. One had a pistol, the other had a phone. And they said, "Call somebody, and the demand is $20 million. I said, it's ridiculous. And they said, "It's not funny. Call someone." I said, "You guys took my backpack when you captured me. I had a notebook with phone numbers. I'm supposed to call the Pulitzer Center." I said, "My phone numbers are in the book." They said, "Call somebody." So I called Mom, the one number that I could remember. But since it was a week later, by then, everybody possible, not just my mother, but also the Pulitzer Center in DC and the Spiegel office in Berlin, had been prepared by the local authorities for a phone call. So my mom, the first thing she did when she answered the phone was ask me the name of my childhood cat. And that told me that she was surrounded by people, maybe not literally that minute, but that she had some kind of support. And I didn't know what kind, but it turned out to be the FBI that was giving her some advice and support. And that was a very nervous phone call because I had never done one of those before. I thought everything I said was going to be really important and really scrutinized, but really it was just proof of life. And my mom was, of course, completely stunned by the idea of a $20 million ransom demand. And over the next year, we had a series of phone calls. I mean, I talked to my mother every month or so, on average. But I don't think the ransom demand came down. So slowly I became aware that the phone calls that I made home were not negotiation phone calls. They had nothing to do, they had no bearing, whatever I said, on the ransom. But my mom was talking separately on the phone to Somalis who were negotiating. But in that first year, it was as if the pirates had no idea how to negotiate. There was no moving around. I mean, fair enough. My mom's counteroffer to the $20 million was $8,000. So when I heard that, part of
Yeah.
me was like, "Oh, Jesus, this is going to take a long time." And the other part was like, "Go on."
um, Quickly, actually, because you talk about calling your mum, I just imagine if you're in a cell there, was there a window there or not at all?
What do you mean? In what
Well,
sense?
when you in your cell, was like a window so you could see sunlight or anything like that at all?
Oh, I see. No, most of the time that we talked on the phone in that first in those first 9 months, it was always outdoors. I don't know why. I think the first few phone calls were done out in the bush, and then within 3 months, the pirates had put me and Rolly on board a fishing vessel that they had captured. I mean, a big one, a, a tuna longliner that we actually saw anchored off Hobyo once it got there, um, by March or so, and I got captured in January. So um, we were kind of moving around a lot and doing phone calls from outdoors somewhere until we were on the ship, and then we were doing phone calls from the ship. So they tried not to do phone calls from where I was being held. You know, even when I was being held almost constantly indoors in a prison house, um, with maybe one or two exceptions, they almost never did a phone call from there. Um, Normally what they wanted to do was drive far enough to use basically a different cell mast, right? They knew where the major masts were and where the cell signal was going to get located to. So they wanted a radius, you know,
Yeah.
40 kilometers away. So we sometimes drove in the middle of the night for hours to a place that was most definitely not where I was being held, and then we drove back.
Yeah. Gosh, it's incredible. It's and the reason I asked that question as well is how do you understand not the concept of time? Because apart from those times when you're going out, like taking out because to make phone calls,
Mhm.
how did you realize how far ahead, not just in terms of a day, but how many days you were there? Because now
Yeah,
you see in films, you get the old, oh, we'll get a stone and we'll put like the lines.
right.
I'm not saying it happened to you, but how did you figure out what date it was?
Well, I couldn't do that because we moved so often, and often we were literally sleeping out in the middle of the field of the field, you know, in the open air. Sometimes I had a notebook, so I tried to keep track of the date. In the first few months until we got placed on the ship. I also did have a radio, a shortwave wave radio, so I could listen to the BBC. And the World Service, by the way, is very bad at giving you the date because it's listened to around the world. So they don't want to tell Australians that it's, you know, the date that it is in London or whatever, when it's not in Perth. So, but still, you can figure out the day of the week if you knew what, you know, more or less what the date was earlier in the week, and they say it's Thursday now on the BBC, then you can, you know, figure it out. Once I was on the ship, that's when my sense of time really started to slew. There was a calendar on the ship that the rest of the crew, there was a crew of almost 30 other guys. And there was a paper calendar on the ship that they were trying to keep track of the date with. And at some point, I was on the ship for 6 months. At some point, maybe 3 months in or less, they had a fist fight over the date. The other hostages did. And from then on, nobody was quite sure what day it was. I think, you know, it was one of two or three possibilities by that point. And then from then on, my sense of the date really wandered. And I don't think it came back until over a year later when I finally got a shortwave radio again. And by then, I had tried to keep track of the date that I thought it was in a notebook. And when I finally pinpointed it, according to what they were saying on the BBC, I was 17 days off. I have no idea if that's good or bad.
Well, considering you didn't have like a lot of stuff at your disposal, I would say that's a half decent effort to be honest. Especially in Somalia, because is Somalia like the US where it has different time zones, or is it like the UK where it's just one time zone?
No, I think it's one time zone. I could be wrong, but I think it's one time zone. Um, but of course, it's a Muslim calendar, so asking my guards was not much use. You know, I didn't know how Ramadan met up with the Western calendar that particular year. So that wasn't very helpful to me. Um, you know, I did know more or less what time of year it was, but I didn't know specifically the date for almost a year and a half.
Mhm. Just say those two hostages on the ship, they're almost having a fist fight over the time
Mhm.
and the date. Is in all seriousness, is that a dangerous thing? Because if the captors find out about it, they're fighting, they could easily come down and say, calm down, basically.
That happened, as a matter of fact. This is not even in the book, but there was a fight over. So the ship was well equipped. It had a working kitchen, and it had it was an old ship, but it had a DVD player and a TV. And there were a lot of Chinese guys on the ship, and some other guys from Cambodia and Vietnam and the Philippines. And after breakfast, the Chinese guys wanted to play Chinese karaoke, and after a while, the other guys got really sick of that, and one
Mm.
of them got woken up by it. I think from an early morning nap by the Chinese karaoke. He got really pissed off. He started to there was a fist fight among several people in the crowd, and a couple of pirates came down and broke it up. And they put three guys on the deck, stomach down, and made like there was going to be physical punishment. I mean, it was almost medieval the way it was happening. And three or four guys on their stomachs, in kind of a stress position. But then they relented, and it was okay. And after a while, somebody tossed the DVD player into the ocean because it stopped working and it was a source of tension.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Um, is it true? And I think I heard this on one of the interviews you've done when this happened, that when Captain Phillips was shown, that some of the people, the pirates depicted in that were actually some of the people that actually kidnapped you. Is that correct?
No, I don't think so. The closest connection, I think, was that one of my guards said that one of the guards who kidnapped Captain Phillips, and I think he's the same guy that wound up in jail in New York, um, were friends.
No.
So one guard I knew was from across the border up in Puntland, where there's a whole separate network of pirates. And the pirates that captured Captain Phillips were mostly Puntland pirates. My guard who showed me Captain Phillips on his phone. So I saw about
Mhm.
45 minutes of that movie while I was still in Somalia. Um, he said that this guy on the screen was his friend.
Right.
So
I take it they weren't very happy with the adaptation. And you're right, that must have made the mood worse.
yeah.
Gosh.
Wait, sorry, you mean the watching the
Yeah,
film?
watching the film, obviously, because there's nothing in the film, it's actually a true story. I
Yeah.
imagine they wouldn't be happy with the adaptation and what happened at the end. And I
It
imagine did that make that mood worse when after watching it?
well, I didn't see it through to the end, but I can't think why they were so interested in watching it because it ends very badly for pirates.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I think if anything, they were interested to see guys that they knew or had heard about, you know, in a movie, that they could just watch on their phones. I mean, a Spielberg movie, and they were. I mean, I say this sort of comically in the book, but maybe they were looking for defense tips, right?
Yeah.
In case the SEALs came in. So I think it was just basic fascination. The 45 minutes of it that I watched in Somalia, I was actually impressed with the atmospherics. So they got the look of Somali pirates and the look of the region very much right. There was also a point where some pirates got recruited on the beach, right? A bunch of guys hold up their hands. Yes, I want to go out. I need money. I want to be a pirate. And then the guy went like this. I'm like, I have never heard of that. Where did Spielberg get that detail? I've been researching this. I've never heard of it being done like that. I'm like, oh shit. No, that's because it's fictional.
Oh,
That's,
gosh.
they would never do that in public. Of course, they recruit non-pirates to be in the pirate gang, but it's a big hurdle to get from outside to inside. They would never do that in public on the beach. Spielberg did that for dramatic effect. But my first impression was motherfucker did his research.
How are pirates recruited? Is it like they're forced to go into the gangs or they just volunteer?
No, no, I've heard that before, normally as a defense in court. No, almost never is someone forced or press ganged into a pirate group. What normally happens is it's done along clan lines, first of all. So relatives, the brother joins up, and then his brother gets either intrigued or convinced, roped in to make some money. All of it is because of money pressure. I mean, there are so few jobs in Somalia still, that piracy, if it were still in action, would be not a bad job choice, except for the violence involved.
So while this has happened, and there's a funny anecdote where we're going to talk about time where I think you overheard the Germany versus Brazil semi-final at the
Oh
World,
yeah,
and you thought because of the score, do you think actually no, it can't be right? You must be hallucinating or something like
yeah. I forget what the final score was on that game, but
7-1. Yeah.
it was a lot. No, I went to bed before it was a late game. Was it the final or the semifinal? It was a late game in the World Cup, and the Pirates stayed up late to watch it. I mean, into the night, and I was allowed, even though technically sundown was my bedtime, I was allowed to sit up in a chair with them, and watch it too. But I think I went to bed before it was over. Um, and I went to bed when it was 0-1 or some normal score. And I woke up in the morning and Germany had won 15-2 or something like that. No, no. And I was so used to getting lied to by the guards. Just tell me the normal score, or tell me what the score was. And there's like 15. Then I heard it on the radio. Like, shit. That was a remarkable game.
Yeah, yeah. I was away at uni at the time, and one of the students, well, she wasn't German, she was Austrian, but she was
Yeah.
rooting for Germany at the time because we were staying away at some camp to do some research project. And that night, I thought I won't bother watch the game, but she did, and all I could hear is goal, goal, goal,
Yeah.
goal. And
Wow.
I was like, what? Yeah, and I just couldn't believe it. But in regards to that, so all this has happened. With regards to negotiations, when was the point where you thought, actually, they're starting to move along now, they're starting to actually get somewhere with negotiations and it might be released soon?
Well, let's see, that World Cup game was actually in 2014, and by then there had been a long gap where there seemed to be no negotiations. So negotiations started at the end of 2012, and through 2013 I kept getting updates, and I had no idea whether to believe them or not. But one guy who seemed to be involved in negotiations, a translator who sort of came and went, whenever he was in the prison house, I could talk to him about it, and it sounded like, the number was coming down. It went from 20 to 10, and then down to 7 and 5. So there seemed to be progress, and then all of a sudden it stalled, and it stalled for a really long time. So I don't think it started up again until after the World Cup in 2014. So it would have been mid 2014 or later, that I started to hear updates again. And by then, everybody was frustrated with the whole thing. I think even the guards were sick of it. So they had started to talk about a labor action, meaning they knew that they were only going to get so much money, which would have been a percentage of the ransom, and that at that point, the demand was low enough that they knew they weren't going to get any more than a certain amount, probably $10,000 each. And from their point of view, why were they sitting around day after day for the same amount of money? So
Mhm.
by late summer of 2014, I started to hear, movement again. And then I heard from one of the guards that they were talking about a strike. And then I started to get phone calls from a guy that I'd never heard of before, who was a professional negotiator, who said he was helping out my mom. I didn't even believe that. I mean, I didn't believe anything at face value by that point in my captivity. I thought he was, trying to find out where I was for the military.
Mhm.
So, but once he got involved, it moved very quickly. I know now that he was a pro bono, but very good negotiator who had just dealt with the same pirate gang to get, I think, 3 Kenyan medical workers out of captivity basically from the same boss. So since he knew the gang, since he knew how they negotiated, the FBI said, he should step in and give my mother a break. My mother had been the voice on the phone the whole time. She was obviously taking advice directly from the FBI, but she was the personality on the phone. And at some point, they decided Bob should sort of step in and close the deal. And in the end, the pirates blinked. I mean, they really want, maybe because the bosses had pressure from below, in other words, from the guards, but also because there was just a sense that it had gone on too long. And I think the bosses wanted their share of it and just to get out of it. So they came down to a certain level, and I think the final number was 1.6 million.
Okay. One thing I was thinking about actually, just so I go quickly back to the start, is your guide before the kidnapping happened when you were in Somalia, he was a cousin of the president,
Yeah, right.
right? So when you were kidnapped and that happened, obviously because he's part of the group, he's involved in that incident.
Yeah.
Do you know if that reached the president? Because I imagine that almost affects the president then, because that's just a family member. Do you know if
Right.
that reached the president, and if so, what happened? Or
I don't know for sure. I mean, I do. I mean, I was told not just by, not really by the president, but eh, we interviewed the president. You know, when we were still both working on stories, Ashwin and I. And after the interview, Mohammed, who was his cousin and who was our guide and fixer, he said, yeah, you can't really be in that position, in a political position like that, in a state as unstable as Galmudug, which is the name of the state or the region. And you can't really be president of a place like that that's so, you know, rotten with pirates on its edges, especially on the coast, without having some support from the pirates. So in other words, you know, you're this important person within the clan, but you do have to deal with the criminal elements in the clan. And I think probably both the clan leader and the president, who were the two most important figures that I saw, had some connection to the pirates. Whether we were obviously betrayed in our guard team. I mean, our guard team disappeared the morning that I was captured. So somebody got paid, somebody got turned and paid off. Whether that money reached either Mohammed, my fixer, or the president, I don't know.
so describe the day when you were released. First of all, did you actually believe it? And what was it like to actually get on the plane to leave the country?
Right. Yeah. The answer is no. I didn't believe it. The morning started with I sort of got up from my mattress in the morning at around 6, and the pirate said, "Michael, there's going to be a phone call." So I sat on my mattress, and they handed me a phone, and I heard Bob's voice, this new negotiator. I still didn't know who he was, and he said, "Well, have they explained to you what's going to happen today?" I said, "No," and the pirate grabbed the phone. He's like, "Proof of life only." Okay, whatever. And that was it until lunchtime, and then I went to the bathroom. I had a guard outside the bathroom, right, in this house. And the houses, by the way, were completely bare. They were concrete shelves. We camped out on the concrete floor. Nothing else but mosquito nets and thin, thin mattresses. But they were compounds, and the compound had a gate, and the gate, when it opened, was unmistakable. Most of the time, it opened to let in a car late at night, because that meant I was going somewhere. They were going to shift me under cover of night. But this time, in the middle of the day, I heard the gate open. Car came in, and my guard outside the bathroom said, "Michael, your car's here." I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, where am I going? And I came out, and there were not just a couple of Somalis, I mean, new Somalis, but guys that I recognized, um, in the room looking very happy with a big sack of cash. I mean, a sealed plastic bag with actual $100 bills in it. But they said, you know, "Michael, you're going free." I said, "Fuck off." I actually, I was so defensive. I mean, I had learned not to believe it when they told me I was going free, because they had told me that so often over 2.5 years, that I assumed they had sold me to another group. And then all the guards came. They said, "First of all, pack your things." All right, I'll pack my things. But then they came around and started to shake my hand. They had packed their things, so they started to say goodbye to me one at a time. Okay, well, I guess I'm going somewhere, right? But then then the story changed. They said I was going to the airport in this car, but then they said no, that the car was going to take me out to the bush and I was going to get handed to some other Somalis somewhere in the bush. I said, see, you guys sold me to another gang. I'm probably going to be here for another year, but it's going to be Al-Shabaab guarding me instead of it's the terrorist group in Somalia. So I still, in spite of the evidence in front of my face, I still didn't believe I was going free. And then they put me in a car, and for the first time I stepped into a car without getting packed into it by 5 or 6 guys with rifles. It was 2 guys, nobody was armed. I wasn't blindfolded, and we drove, in plain daylight through Galkayo. I was like, this is the first time I've driven through Galkayo, without a blindfold on, normally at night, since I was a free journalist. So by then I knew something strange was going on. And when they stopped in the bush outside the city limits, a white car pulled up, and a guy that I recognized, a pirate that I recognized, got out and got in to the car I had been in, which means a pirate got out of one car, got into the pirate car, I got out and got into the white car. There was only one guy in there. He was a driver, unarmed. He said, yeah, you're going free. And then he said, you're going free and your mom's in a hotel in North Calcutta. I was like, damn it, will somebody please tell me the truth? And he pulled out his phone and he called my mother. And it was not just my mother on the phone, but Bob, the negotiator. And I said, well, where are you? I had assumed Bob was in Nairobi and my mother was in California. And they said, no, we're both in California. You're going free. They said, what color is your car? I said, it's a white car. They're like, okay. They were watching a feed. They were watching a video feed. So then and my mom said she had listened to both phone calls that day, and she said the difference in the sound of my voice between that conversation and the one that morning was like night and day. So at that moment, I knew I was going free, and I think I had to change cars one more time, and then we drove to the airport where I met one pilot who landed in a Cessna. His name was Derek. I'd been told his name was Derek. I wasn't told exactly who he was. And I describe him in my book as a bush pilot, but he absolutely knew what he was doing. When we took off finally, he said he was former Special Air Forces, born in Africa, but a British citizen. And he was he was more than just a bush pilot, he was a mercenary. So he could handle himself. I mean, he had flown in entirely alone. And one of the first things he said to me also once we took off was, I know 2 of your friends. I said, what do who? He said, the 2 Seychellois, the 2 fishermen. He said, when they got out, I flew them out. And that was the first time that I had heard that Rolly and Mark were still alive. The last time I had seen them was on the ship. No, the last time I had seen Rolly was on the ship. Mark, his friend, had been kept on land, and I hadn't seen him in a little while. So I had heard a rumor that they'd been ransomed and that kind of thing, but it was very moving to hear in that plane that Rolly and Mark were still alive. So.
Gosh. I can't imagine when you landed and when you're finally on US soil,
Yeah.
just the mental weight must have gone, oh, thank God I'm here.
Yeah. So I went back to Berlin. My apartment was here, so I came back to Berlin. But we first went to Nairobi, where I spent a couple of days recuperating. But I was still surrounded by strangers. I was surrounded. I'm also a German citizen, so I was surrounded by American FBI and the German equivalent, basically law enforcement people. And it was nice to speak in English and German again, but there was nobody there that I really knew, except for a Spiegel journalist who found himself in Nairobi and came to see me at the embassy. So that was the first person I recognized. It was a big relief to see him. And then I flew back to Berlin, and that's where I saw my family again. I mean, my mom actually flew out from California. The rest of my German family flew out or other people, her siblings flew out from West Germany. And then, of course, all my friends in Berlin. It was completely wonderful. But I was in such a constricted state of mind that that day of going free was just a series of small, reliefs.
Yeah,
There was
yeah,
no moment that felt triumphant. It was just, oh my God, I think it's true. Oh my God, it is true. This will be nice, you know. And then slowly, when I could sleep in a nice bed and have a shave and take a shower and stuff like that in Nairobi, I started to get used to the idea.
yeah. I mean, I can't fathom what it's like. As I said to you at the beginning, like when I was a kid, growing up in the UK, we had John McCarthy and then Tay White,
Yeah,
back there and stuff. And just from the news itself and then reporting from Lebanon, you see the environment, but you can never really know what it's
right,
actually like. And
right.
even with your story, I can't begin to imagine what it was like and so on and so forth. How long, once you landed in Berlin, how long was it before you started writing again? Like, how long was you basically recovery period?
Uh, let's see. About a month, maybe a little bit longer. I had 3 weeks of talking about it. So the both the German and the American officials wanted to hear the whole story right away. So I had 3 weeks of going into the embassy every day to give them the full detailed story so that they could use that um, to for you know to do any criminal investigations. Um, so that was my first draft of the book. But then I asked them for a transcript of it. They said, no, that's evidence. So I had to sit down at some point later and start to reconstruct it all. I was really frustrated because I had tried to keep journals a couple of times while I was captive, and the pirates took my notebooks twice and let me leave with a stack of notebooks at the end. But by then I had started to write fiction in the notebooks and not keep a journal because I didn't want it to get confiscated. That
Mhm.
worked. So, they would go through the journal and go, is this the made up story about the fish? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, what are you making up stories for? And then there were a couple of exceptions, a couple of scenes. I wrote down dialogue in very, very small hand and took notes in German. And then, but when I came home, I said, well, I only have a few scenes that I actually took notes on. What am I going to do? Have I remembered enough to write a book? And when I sat down to write what basically I had wished I had written as a journal, tried to write as detailed a full draft as I could, I realized, oh my God, I have so much material just up in my head that I can, in essence, the book is what I am absolutely sure of in that, trove of memories. It was once you start to sit down to unpack, this day or this scene or this sequence of events, it's kind of incredible how much more memory starts to come flooding in. And so in the end, lack of material was not my problem. Um, with a couple of scenes, I wished I had taken very precise notes about the dialogue. So I had to reconstruct the dialogue a few times, but in a couple of the most important conversations, those came directly from notes.
I can't. I mean, we talked about it for nearly an hour. I just can't sum it up in an hour. That's incredible. A really incredible story. But at the start, I said about you've written more books. That's the main book I know you by. But you also
Yeah,
written a book, which we'll talk about very briefly, Sweetness and Blood, which is about surfing.
yeah.
Obviously, I've read your surfer yourself,
Mhm.
but which is one reason to write it. But then, from what I was hearing, it wasn't just I thought it'd be based in America only,
No,
Australia. But how did you find out about these places that did surfing, like the Gaza Strip and Berlin, for instance?
well, that's just it. I wouldn't have had the idea for the book if I had stayed in California. It was only after moving to Berlin that I started to realize that there was a surf scene in Germany, and then a surf scene in England, and a surf scene in Japan, surf scene in Israel, another one in the Gaza Strip, and more than one in Africa. So I started to get very curious about how these scenes got started, because where I'm from in California, Redondo Beach is historically or mythically and very famously the town where surfing arrived in America from Hawaii. Hawaii was still not a state in 1908 when George Freeth came over and started exhibition surfing in Redondo Beach. So that's part of the myth of my hometown. And I thought, well, who's the George Freeth of Germany? You know, or in Israel or in Indonesia for that matter. So I made a list of countries where there was that mythical first surfer. Almost certainly there was always somebody before that person too, but there was a founder. You know, there was someone who was either known to be the first surfer or was really the person who seeded the culture there. You know, after whom there was no going back. So and that was interesting in every case. And so I did my research and then I went to the countries, and that was an enormous amount of fun. I mean, that was really, you know, one of the most fun phases of my life. And I did surf in Gaza. I mean, it was between incursions by Israel, by the way. We went through Gaza City when there was rubble. And when we went out, I actually went out with one of the guys in the Gaza Surf Club on a stand-up paddleboard because the waves weren't very good that day. And when we went out, we could actually hear gunfire from Israeli ships that were keeping the Palestinian fishermen to a certain limit. I think it was I forget what the limit was, but they didn't want them to go out any further to fish because they were worried about people going around, you know, the limit and I don't know, bringing something into Israel or something. So, and one of those guys at least one of those guys from the Gaza Surf Club has been killed in the meantime in the violence. So, it's very, but at the same time, I got to know Israel too. So I'm not susceptible to a lot of rhetoric about what's going on down there. But relatively, it was a peaceful time, and the stories on both sides of the Gaza border were absolutely fascinating and really enlightening to, you know, the cultures of both places. The first surfers in Gaza were really recent, and for a long time it was two guys who formed the heart of the Gaza Surf Club, who were sharing a surfboard. And then the guy who had founded surfing essentially in the 50s in Israel saw an article about them and decided to bring a bunch of surfboards over. And he brought maybe a dozen boards to the Erez crossing. And from that moment on, there was a group of, you know, an actual club, a group of surfers in Gaza who could form a club. So.
Just quickly then, if people want to find out more about your work and your articles you write, where can I go to?
Radiofreemike.net is my website, and I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, but radiofreemike.net is the best place.
I'll leave this in the description below. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I mean, my mind's still blown by, even though I've read the book when it first was published, my mind's still blown by what you just said. So I do really appreciate it, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks a lot.